Picture this. A guy's just trying to fix his Wi-Fi, standing in his own yard, minding his business, when suddenly sirens scream, cops roll up, and his nosy neighbors pointing fingers like he's some master criminal. Why? Because she felt something was off. But here's the kicker. While she's busy calling 911 on an innocent man, the real danger's been hiding closer than anyone could have guessed. Watching, waiting, and recording everything. How does a simple password change unravel a neighborhood's darkest secret? And what happens when the person you trust most turns out to be the one pulling the strings? Welcome to a story that'll make you question who's really watching you and who you're quick to blame. Stick around because this one's got twists you won't see coming and a lesson that might just save you from making the same mistake. If you're ready for the ride, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and turn on the bell. We're diving in right now. Darius Coleman lived the kind of life most people never noticed, and that's exactly how he wanted it. At 32, he'd carved out a quiet existence in a modest wooden house on the edge of Crestwood, Missouri, a sleepy suburb where the streets were lined with picket fences and the air carried the faint hum of lawnmowers on weekends. A software engineer by trade, Darius spent his days hunched over a laptop, headphones on, fingers dancing across the keys as lines of code spilled onto the screen like digital poetry. His world was small but deliberate, a tidy desk littered with coffee mugs, a front yard with grass trimmed to military precision, and a strict policy of keeping the neighbors at arm's length. He wasn't rude. He'd nod politely if someone waved, but he wasn't here for small talk or block parties either. Privacy was his currency, and he guarded it fiercely. That Thursday afternoon, though, something cracked the surface of his carefully curated calm. It started with the Wi-Fi. Darius had just wrapped a grueling Zoom call with his boss, the kind where every third word cut out and the video froze on awkward half-smiles. Later, when he tried streaming his favorite jazz playlist, Coltrane's saxophone weaving through the air, the music stuttered, buffering every few seconds like a broken record. He leaned back in his chair, brow furrowed, muttering under his breath, "No way, this is the provider screwing up again." Something felt off, a nagging itch he couldn't ignore. He grabbed his phone, opened the router app, and scrolled through the list of connected devices. His setup was simple: phone, laptop, smart TV, 3 dots on a digital map he knew by heart. But there, lurking among them, was an intruder, Crestwood_I01. The name wasn't a random string of letters and numbers like you'd expect from a glitch. It was deliberate, personal, like someone had planted a flag in his network and dared him to notice. Darius's pulse quickened. He lived alone. He didn't share his password, not with friends, not with anyone. So who the hell was this? He didn't hesitate. Darius wasn't the type to let a breach slide, not when it came to his space. He tapped the screen, kicked the unknown device off his network, and reset the Wi-Fi password to something unbreakable. A 20-character mess of letters, numbers, and symbols he scribbled on a Post-it so he wouldn't lock himself out. The signal flickered inside the house, so he stepped out to the front yard for a stronger connection. The late afternoon sun burned red across the horizon, casting long shadows over the driveway. He leaned against the porch post, phone in hand, the cool wood pressing into his back as he typed. A breeze rustled through the oak trees, carrying the sharp scent of freshly cut grass. A fleeting moment of peace he'd soon realize was his last. Across the street, Melanie Foster watched him from her kitchen window. At 45, she was the self-appointed sentinel of Crestwood Lane, a woman who thrived on knowing everyone's business and bristled when someone didn't play along. Her house was a shrine to suburban perfection: lace curtains, a flower box overflowing with petunias, and a fridge stocked with casseroles she'd foist on anyone who lingered too long. But Darius, he was a puzzle she couldn't crack. He didn't wave back with enough enthusiasm. He skipped her 4th of July barbecue last summer. And that aloofness, it gnawed at her, festering into something she couldn't name. She stood there now, coffee mug cold in her grip, peering through the half-drawn blinds as Darius lingered in his yard. His fingers moved fast across his phone screen, too fast for her liking. Her eyes narrowed. "What's he up to?" she muttered, lips pursing. Her mind raced, conjuring scenarios straight out of a crime podcast she'd binged the night before. Hacking? Stalking? Something worse? She didn't know what exactly, but the sight of him standing there, tall, quiet, focused, lit a spark of unease she couldn't shake. Melanie didn't need proof. She had a feeling, and in her world, that was enough. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the mug down and reached for her phone. The kitchen clock ticked in the silence, each second amplifying her resolve. She dialed 911, her voice low but edged with urgency when the operator picked up. "Hello? Yes, I need to report something suspicious. My neighbor, he's out in his yard, messing with his phone like he's up to no good. I don't know what he's doing, but it's not right. Can you send someone to check?" The dispatcher's calm questions. "Does he have a weapon? Is he threatening anyone?" Only fueled her impatience. "No, I don't see a gun, but I've got a bad feeling about this. He's been out there too long, just tapping away. Please, hurry." She hung up, heart pounding, a strange mix of fear and triumph swelling in her chest. From the window she watched Darius, oblivious to the storm she just unleashed. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, and for a moment everything was still, but not for long. Sirens were already wailing in the distance. Faint at first, then louder, slicing through the suburban quiet like a blade. Melanie tightened her grip on the curtains. She'd done her part, she told herself. Whatever happened next, it wasn't her fault. Darius, still leaning against the porch, glanced up as the sound grew closer. His brow creased, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "That's not for me," he thought, dismissing it. But deep down, a quiet dread began to coil in his gut. He had no idea that a simple password change was about to turn his life upside down, or that the real danger wasn't in his hands, but hiding somewhere much closer than he could have imagined. The sirens grew louder, a shrill crescendo slicing through the late afternoon calm of Crestwood Lane. Darius Coleman straightened from his lean against the porch post, his phone still warm in his hand from resetting the Wi-Fi password. His dark eyes narrowed as a squad car rolled into view, its red and blue lights pulsing like a heartbeat against the fading sunset. The vehicle slowed, then stopped squarely in front of his driveway. Two officers stepped out, their boots crunching on the gravel with deliberate weight. Darius's jaw tightened. "This can't be for me," he muttered under his breath, but the sinking feeling in his chest told him otherwise. The first officer was tall and broad-shouldered, his sharp features framed by a buzz cut that gleamed faintly under the dying light. Detective Louis Navarro carried himself like a man who'd seen too much to be rattled easily, his voice a low rumble as he called out, "Sir, we need a word." Beside him, Officer Belle Carter was smaller, her frame compact but radiating quiet authority. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, locked onto Darius, scanning him with a precision that made his skin prickle. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there with his arms loose at his sides, the phone dangling in one hand like a silent witness. "We got a call about suspicious activity," Navarro said, his hand resting near his belt, not on his holster, but close enough to send a message. "Mind telling us what you're doing out here?" Darius frowned, the absurdity of the question hitting him like a slap. "I'm changing my Wi-Fi password," he said, his tone steady but laced with a faint edge of disbelief. "Standing in my own yard. That a problem?" He glanced between the officers, searching their faces for some hint of what was happening. Suspicious activity? He'd been out here 5 minutes, maybe 10. Tops. Before Navarro could respond, a voice cut through the air like a whip. "He's lying!" Darius turned his head, and there she was, Melanie Foster, stepping out onto her porch across the street, arms crossed tight over her chest. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her eyes glinted with a mix of fear and righteousness. "She's always sneaking around, messing with that phone of hers," she shouted, her words tumbling out fast like she'd rehearsed them in her head. "He's been out there forever, just tapping away, looking around like he's watching people. I know he's up to something." Darius blinked, his mouth parting slightly before he caught himself. "Are you serious?" he said, turning fully to face her. His voice stayed calm, but there was a steel beneath it now, a flicker of frustration breaking through. I've been out here fixing my router because someone's been leeching off my Wi-Fi. That's it. You called the cops over this? He held up his phone, the screen still glowing with the router app, as if it could somehow prove his innocence to the woman glaring at him from her perch. Melanie scoffed, her lips curling. Oh, sure, that's what you say. I'm supposed to just believe you? She took a step forward, her porch creaking under her weight, and pointed a trembling finger at him. You never talk to anyone, never join in. How do we know what you're really doing? Navarro raised a hand, cutting off her tirade. Ma'am, let's take it down a notch, he said, his patience audibly thinning. He turned back to Darius, his expression unreadable. You live here, sir? Darius almost laughed, the question so ridiculous it bordered on surreal. Yeah, he said, crossing his arms. 3 years. My car's in the driveway. My name's on the mailbox. Want me to grab my lease while we're at it? His sarcasm was subtle, but it hung in the air, a quiet challenge. Navarro didn't bite. He exchanged a quick glance with Carter, who'd been silent so far, her eyes flicking between Darius and Melanie like she was piecing together a puzzle. All right, Navarro said, nodding toward the phone in Darius's hand. You mind if we take a look at those router settings? Just to clear this up. Darius's jaw clenched. He shouldn't have to prove anything. Not in his own yard, not over something as mundane as a Wi-Fi reset, but he knew the game. He'd seen how these situations could spiral, how a raised voice or a wrong move could turn a misunderstanding into handcuffs. Fine, he muttered, unlocking his phone with a swipe. He pulled up the router app and tilted the screen toward Navarro. Knock yourself out. Navarro leaned in, his eyes scanning the list of connected devices. There it was, plain as day. Crestwood I-01, still lingering like a ghost despite Darius's efforts to banish it. The detective's brow furrowed, and Carter stepped closer, her posture shifting from observer to investigator. Who owns that device? Navarro asked, his voice sharper now. Not me, Darius said, shaking his head. I live alone. That's why I changed the password. Someone's been on my network who shouldn't be. Carter's eyebrows shot up. So you're saying someone's using your Wi-Fi without permission? Her tone was neutral, but there was a spark of curiosity behind it. Darius nodded, his frustration simmering just below the surface. Yeah, and I don't think they're just streaming Netflix. Look at this. He tapped the screen, pulling up the connection logs. The data hit him like a punch. They weren't random spikes. The unknown device had been active non-stop, pulling bandwidth around the clock. This isn't casual use, he said, his voice dropping. They're watching something. Navarro's posture stiffened, his hand drifting an inch closer to his belt. Watching? He repeated, the word hanging heavy in the air. Darius met his gaze, unflinching. That's what it looks like. And I don't know about you, but I'd bet it's not just my network they're messing with. Across the street, Melanie faltered, her arms dropping slightly. Wait, what do you mean watching? She called out, her bravado cracking for the first time. She stepped off the porch, edging closer despite herself, drawn by the shift in the air. Darius turned to her, his eyes cold and steady. I mean someone's spying, Melanie. Maybe on me. Maybe on you. Maybe on all of us. His words landed like stones, each one sinking deeper into the silence that followed. Navarro straightened, his face hardening. All right, Mr. Coleman, he said, his tone all business now. Let's take this inside. I want to see exactly what we're dealing with. Carter nodded, her hand brushing the radio on her shoulder, ready to call it in. Darius didn't argue. He grabbed his phone and led the way, his steps heavy with a mix of irritation and unease. Melanie trailed behind, her earlier certainty unraveling with every breath. She'd wanted answers, but not like this. Not something that made her skin crawl and her stomach twist. As the front door clicked shut behind them, the squad car's lights still flashed outside, bathing the street in an eerie glow. Darius had been minding his own business, just trying to secure his little corner of the world. Now, thanks to a single phone call, he was at the center of something bigger, something none of them could have seen coming. The front door of Darius Coleman's house clicked shut with a hollow snap, locking him inside with Detective Louis Navarro, Officer Belle Carter, and a jittery Melanie Foster. The living room stretched out before them, a sparse canvas of a man who valued function over flair. A leather sofa scarred with years of use, a coffee table strewn with dog-eared tech manuals, and a laptop perched on the dining table, its screen casting a pale blue glow across the worn hardwood. Beyond the blinds, the squad car's red-blue lights slashed through the dusk, painting the walls with restless, jagged streaks. Darius dropped his phone beside the laptop, its weight thudding against the wood, and hovered his fingers over the keys. He didn't want this. Didn't want cops trampling through his sanctuary. Didn't want Melanie's wide, anxious eyes tracking his every move. But the violation clawing at his gut wouldn't let him back down. Someone had breached his world, and he'd be damned if he let it slide. "Let's get this done," he said, his voice low and taut, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. He opened the router app, fingers swift as he mirrored it onto the laptop screen. The interface flared to life, stark white text against a black void, and there it was. Crestwood Ari I-01, glaring back like a stubborn stain he couldn't scrub out, even after resetting the password. Navarro loomed over his shoulder, his broad frame casting a shadow, his breath a steady rhythm in the stillness. Carter stood a step back, arms crossed, her sharp gaze dissecting the scene with surgical precision. Melanie lingered near the doorway, her sweater bunched in her fists, her shallow breaths fogging the air with nervous energy. "Show me those logs you talked about," Navarro said. His tone clipped, the casual skepticism from earlier replaced by a hard edge. Darius nodded, clicking into the activity history. A flood of data scrolled past, timestamps ticking off like a countdown, bandwidth spikes spiking like a heartbeat, until his hand froze mid-motion. His throat tightened as the numbers told a story he hadn't expected. "This thing," he said, jabbing a finger at the screen, "it's been pulling data nonstop, not random hits. Look at this. It's constant, like it's feeding something. Day in, day out." His voice dropped, a chill seeping into every word. "And it's not just my network." Carter stepped forward, her boots scuffing the floor, her compact frame radiating quiet intensity. "Feeding what?" she asked, her calm voice masking a hunger for the truth that glinted in her eyes. Darius exhaled, a sharp, ragged sound, as he shifted to his security dashboard. He'd set up the cameras himself, a cheap system from a year ago, just enough to watch the porch, the backyard, and the corner of his office where his gear sat. The feeds loaded one by one, the porch where he'd stood minutes ago, bathed in twilight's fading glow. The oak tree swaying in the evening breeze, its branches clawing at the sky, his desk chair still angled from this morning's coffee spill. Then he clicked into the access logs and his stomach plummeted. "Someone's been in here," he said, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking it aloud made it real. "My cameras, live feeds, they've been watching me." He turned the laptop, the screen's glow illuminating their faces. The logs were undeniable. Unauthorized logins stretching back weeks, some as recent as last night when he'd crashed on the sofa, oblivious, his privacy stripped away in the dark. Navarro's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek as he leaned closer, the faint scent of coffee lingering on his breath. "You're saying someone's hacked your security system?" he asked, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the room. "That's exactly what I'm saying," Darius shot back, his tone hardening as he scrolled through the evidence, timestamps piling up like accusations. "But it's not just me." He flicked back to the router logs, his fingers trembling with a mix of fury and dread as he highlighted a cluster of IP addresses. "These aren't mine," he said, his voice rising. "They're from other houses, down the street, across the lane. Whoever's doing this, they've got hooks in half the neighborhood." Carter's expression darkened, her hand brushing the radio on her shoulder as if itching to call it in. "A coordinated breach?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with disbelief. "Multiple homes?" Darius nodded, his pulse hammering as he leaned into the screen. "Yeah, they set a trap, probably a fake Wi-Fi signal, and people connected without knowing. Once they're in, it's over. Cameras, phones, anything linked." He paused, then opened a live feed aggregator he'd built for testing, his breath catching as the screen flickered and loaded. Not just his feeds now. New images spilled out, unbidden and invasive. A hallway with peeling wallpaper, a flickering bulb swinging overhead, a living room with a tabby cat curled on an armchair, purring in ignorance. Then a bedroom, curtains drawn tight, a quilt crumpled over the bed, a pair of slippers peeking out from under the frame. Melanie let out a scream, a raw, guttural sound that tore through the silence. "Stop! That's my house!" Her hand flew to her mouth, muffling a sob as she stumbled forward, her knees buckling. "That's my hallway, my cat, my bedroom. Oh God, how is this happening?" Darius spun to face her, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "Because someone's been watching us, Melanie. All of us. They've turned our homes into their damn TV show." His voice cracked with fury, his fist slamming the table, rattling the coffee mugs. "They've got us wired, and we didn't even know it." Navarro straightened, his face a mask of barely contained urgency as he yanked his radio free. "Dispatch, this is Navarro. I need cybercrime at 142 Crestwood Lane. Stat, multiple residences breached, unauthorized surveillance. Get here yesterday." He clipped it back, turning to Carter, his voice dropping to a mutter. "This isn't some kid stealing bandwidth. This is big." Carter nodded, her hand twitching toward her holster, her eyes still locked on the screen. "If we don't kill this now, they could have seen everything, every secret, every move." Darius barely registered their words, his focus consumed by the logs. He traced the data flow, his tech instincts kicking into gear like a hunter on a scent. "Wait," he said suddenly, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. "This doesn't add up." He angled the laptop toward Navarro, pointing at a buried line of code. "The data's not going far. It's routing right here in the neighborhood. But look at this. It's too clean, too hidden. Whoever's pulling this, they're not amateurs. They're pros, and they're covering their tracks." Melanie's head snapped up, her tears pausing midstream. "You mean it's someone close by?" Her voice quavered, a thread of fear weaving through it. Darius's stomach twisted as he cross-referenced signal strength, his fingers flying across the keys. The map overlay locked onto a point, a sickeningly familiar address. He looked up, his voice flat and cold. "It's your house, Melanie. It's coming from Brandon." "No," she whispered, shaking her head like she could erase the words. "No, that's impossible. He couldn't." Her protest trailed off, her mind racing back to the boy in her spare room. Brandon Foster, 22, always hunched over his computer, eyes shadowed from late nights, his quietness a shield she'd never questioned. Doubt crept in, a cold hand gripping her chest. Carter's tone was steel, cutting through the haze. "We're talking to him, now." Darius stood, his chair scraping the floor with a harsh screech. "I'm coming," he said, his voice a wall of resolve. Navarro shot him a hard look, his hand raised to object. But Darius didn't flinch. "This started with my network, my home. I'm not sitting it out." "Stay back and let us handle it," Navarro warned, but he relented with a curt nod. Melanie led the way out, her steps faltering, her breath hitching as they crossed the threshold into the night. Every crunch of gravel underfoot felt like a countdown, her mind screaming denials while a whisper grew louder, sharper. What if it's true? The streetlights buzzed faintly, the air biting at their skin as they moved toward her house, the truth lurking like a predator in the shadows, waiting to pounce. The night air stung Darius Coleman's face as he trailed Navarro and Carter across Crestwood Lane, Melanie Foster stumbling ahead like a marionette with cut strings. Her house rose before them, its white siding ghostly under the moonlight, the petunias in the flower box drooping like mourners at a funeral. She fumbled her keys at the door, her trembling fingers dropping them into the dirt once before Navarro's steady hand guided them into the lock. The door swung open with a creak, and she called out, her voice splintering against the silence. "Brandon, come downstairs, please." The words echoed into the void, answered only by the relentless tick of the living room clock, its rhythm a mocking pulse in the stillness. Navarro exchanged a glance with Carter, his hand drifting toward his belt, not touching his gun, but close enough to signal intent. "We're going up," he said, his tone a steel beam, unyielding. Melanie didn't argue, just wrapped her arms tighter around herself, her sweater slipping off one shoulder as her breath came in shallow gasps. Darius followed close behind, his pulse thudding in his ears, a drumbeat of anger and dread. The stairs groaned under their weight, each step a protest as they climbed. The hallway stretched narrow and dim, lined with faded photos, Melanie beaming at a barbecue, Brandon as a gap-toothed kid grinning with a soccer ball, now twisted into cruel echoes of a life unraveling. They stopped at Brandon's door, its chipped paint and peeling "Keep Out" sticker, a flimsy barrier to the storm brewing beyond. No light bled from underneath, no sound stirred the air, until Navarro's fist hammered against it, a thunderclap that rattled the frame. "Brandon Foster, this is the police. Open the door. We need to talk." Silence held for a heartbeat. Then, a faint scrape, a chair sliding, followed by footsteps, quick and panicked. Carter's hand snapped to her holster, her voice a whip. "Open it now, or we're coming in." The knob turned, slow and reluctant, the door creaking open to reveal Brandon Foster. He stood there, lanky and pale, his dark hair a wild tangle over bloodshot eyes that darted like a cornered animal's. His faded hoodie hung loose, his sweatpants stained at the knees, his hands twitching at his sides as if searching for something to hold on to. What's going on?" he stammered, his gaze bouncing between Navarro's stern face, Carter's cold stare, and Melanie, who hovered behind like a wraith, her breath hitching. Navarro's eyes bore into him, unblinking. "We know you've been accessing private security cameras in this neighborhood. Start talking." Brandon's face twitched, a flicker of defiance surfacing before he forced a scoff. That's ridiculous," he said, his voice pitching too high, cracking at the edges. "I don't know what you're talking about." He half turned toward his desk, a chaotic sprawl of cables, a glowing monitor flickering with a login prompt, and a tower PC humming faintly in the corner, his body betraying the lie as his shoulders tensed. Carter tilted her head, her voice cutting through his flimsy shield. "Then you won't mind us checking your laptop?" She nodded toward the desk where the screen pulsed like a heartbeat, daring him to refuse. Brandon's jaw clenched, his eyes flicking to the device with a flash of panic. "You don't have a warrant," he snapped, his tone sharpening, a crack splitting his facade. "You can't just barge in here and—" "We'll get one," Navarro interrupted, stepping forward, his bulk filling the doorway like a storm cloud. "But right now I'm giving you a chance to come clean before this gets uglier than it needs to. Your call, kid." The room fell into a tense, suffocating silence, the air thick with unspoken stakes. Brandon ran a shaky hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his choices had finally crushed him. "Okay, He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I messed around a little. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal." Melanie shoved past Darius, her voice breaking as tears brimmed in her eyes. "Brandon, please, tell me they've got this wrong. Tell me you didn't do this." His gaze met hers, and for a fleeting moment, his mask shattered, guilt pooling in his eyes, raw and unguarded. "I didn't mean for it to spiral," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the PC. "It started as a prank. I hacked Darius's Wi-Fi to mess with him. Just a dumb challenge." Navarro's voice was a blade, cold and precise. "So you admit you breached his network?" Brandon nodded, a jerky, reluctant motion. "Yeah, but what?" Carter pressed, her eyes narrowing to slits. "You didn't stop there, did you?" He didn't answer right away, his gaze dropping to the floor, his fingers curling into his hoodie. Then quieter, he said, "I saw his cameras. I got in, and I couldn't stop." The confession hung heavy. A stone dropped into still water, rippling through the room. "Couldn't stop?" Carter's tone was ice, her words dripping with contempt. "How many people have you watched, Brandon? How far did you take this?" Silence stretched again, a tightrope snapping under the strain. Brandon's voice fell to a whisper, barely audible. "Too many. I saw everything." His eyes flicked to Melanie, a glimmer of shame breaking through. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone, Aunt Mel. I watched." Melanie staggered back, her hand clutching the doorframe as a sob tore from her throat. "You watched us?" Your own family? Her voice cracked, her knees buckling as the betrayal sank in, a knife twisting in her chest. Before Brandon could respond, Navarro lunged for the laptop. Move! He growled, shoving the kid aside. Brandon stumbled, then, panic seizing him, threw himself back at the desk, his hands slamming the keyboard with a frantic yell. No! I won't let them find me! Keys clattered, the screen flickering wildly as he tried to erase his tracks. Navarro yanked him away, pinning him against the wall with a thud, the boy's wrist twisting in his grip. The monitor settled, a chat log bursting onto the display. Green text on black, stark and damning. Darius surged forward, his voice a razor's edge. What the hell is that? He leaned in, his breath catching as the words glowed in the dimness. Navarro held Brandon firm, reading aloud, his voice a low snarl. Next batch by midnight, $500, or you're dead. Sent 2 hours ago. He spun Brandon around, his grip tightening until the kid winced. Who's this? Who are you working for? Brandon's breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes wild with terror. I don't know their faces. It's some dark web group. Spectre. I owed money, gambling debts, thousands. I got in deep online. They found me, said they'd wipe it if I sent footage. Then they threatened to kill me if I stopped. Tears streamed down his face, his voice breaking into a desperate wail. They've got my name, my address, everything. I didn't have a choice. Melanie sank to her knees, her hands covering her face as sobs shook her frame. Gambling? Brandon, how could you do this to us? Her words dissolved into a keening cry, the boy she'd raised now a stranger wearing her nephew's skin. Darius's fists clenched, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. You sold us out. For what? A way out of your mess? He stepped closer, towering over Brandon, his anger a live wire sparking in the air. You let them into my home, her home, every home on this street. I didn't want this, Brandon cried, his voice cracking as he strained against Navarro's hold. You don't get it. They'd kill me. You don't know what Spectre's like. Navarro snapped the cuffs on, the metal biting into Brandon's wrist with a sharp click. Brandon Foster, you're under arrest. Unauthorized access of a computer network. Unlawful surveillance. He hauled the kid up, his movements swift and unyielding. Carter grabbed her radio, her voice crisp. Dispatch, suspect in custody. Links to a cybercrime ring. Spectre. Send backup in a forensic team to 148 Crestwood Lane, now. Brandon crumpled, his sobs echoing as Navarro dragged him toward the stairs. Melanie stayed on the floor, her hands pressed to her face, her world shattered into fragments she couldn't piece back together. Darius watched, his chest tight with a storm of fury and resolve. A pawn had been caught, his confession spilling the truth. But the shadow of Spectre loomed larger, a faceless threat still pulling strings from the dark. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The night swallowed Crestwood Lane as Detective Navarro and Officer Carter escorted Brandon Foster down the front steps of Melanie's house, the metallic clink of his handcuffs cutting through the stillness. The squad car's lights spun relentlessly, painting the street in a kaleidoscope of red and blue that reflected off the windows of silent homes. Homes that, until tonight, had no idea they'd been laid bare to unseen eyes. Brandon's head hung low, his lanky frame slumping between the officers, tears streaking his pale cheeks. Melanie remained inside, crumpled on the hallway floor, her sobs echoing faintly as the door swung shut behind them. Darius Coleman stood on the sidewalk, his hands still buried in his pockets, watching the scene unfold with a face carved from stone. Navarro guided Brandon into the back of the patrol car, the door slamming with a finality that seemed to ripple through the air. He turned to Carter, his voice a low rumble. Get him processed. I'll stay until the forensic team arrives. This Spectre group isn't some basement hacker crew. We need every byte of data off that laptop. Carter nodded, her sharp eyes flicking toward Darius before she slid into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and within seconds the car peeled away, leaving a trail of gravel dust and an eerie quiet in its wake. Darius didn't move. The weight of the night pressed against his ribs. Hours ago, he'd been a man minding his own business, resetting his Wi-Fi to reclaim a sliver of control. Now he was the linchpin in a nightmare that had unraveled his neighborhood, thread by thread. He glanced back at Melanie's house, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky, and felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. Anger, maybe, or pity. Then Navarro's heavy footsteps crunched toward him, pulling him back. "You were right," Navarro said, his gruff voice softened by a rare note of admiration. "If you hadn't caught that device, we'd still be chasing our tails. Might have never known how deep this went." Darius let out a slow breath, his eyes fixed on the spot where the squad car had vanished. "Yeah, well, I didn't catch it fast enough to keep the cops off my doorstep," he said, his tone dry but edged with a bitterness he couldn't hide. He turned to Navarro, his gaze steady. "Crazy thing is, I was the one out there changing my password, trying to lock things down, and I'm the one who got the 911 call. Meanwhile, the real threat was eating dinner at her table." Navarro's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He'd seen the reports, heard the stories. Situations like this weren't new to him. "She made a bad call," he admitted, glancing toward Melanie's house. "But you kept your head. That's what matters." Before Darius could respond, the front door creaked open, and Melanie staggered out onto the porch. Her face was a mess of mascara and tears, her sweater slipping off one shoulder as she clutched the railing for support. "Darius," she croaked, her voice raw and trembling. She took a shaky step forward, her eyes pleading. I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I made a horrible mistake. And I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Darius turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. The streetlight cast harsh shadows across his features, highlighting the lines of tension etched into his brow. He let her words hang there, heavy and desperate, before he spoke. "You didn't know about Brandon," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "But you did know you had no reason to call the cops on me. You didn't see a gun. You didn't see a crime. You saw me, standing in my yard, minding my business, and you decided that was enough to make me a threat." Melanie flinched, her hands twisting together. I had a feeling. I thought I was protecting." "Protecting who?" Darius cut her off, his tone sharpening. "Yourself? The neighborhood? From what? A guy with a phone?" "You didn't protect anyone, Melanie. You put a target on my back because you couldn't see past your own fear. And the whole time, the real danger was sleeping under your roof." She opened her mouth, then closed it, her shoulders sagging under the weight of his words. Tears welled up again, but she didn't wipe them away. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll never forgive myself. I'm sorry." Darius held her gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between them. Then he shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. "I don't need your apology," he said, his voice softening but firm. "I need you to do better. Not for me. For the next person you're tempted to judge before you know the truth." He turned away, his boots scuffing the pavement as he started toward his house. "Figure that out, Melanie. That's what matters." Navarro watched him go, then glanced at Melanie, who stood frozen on the porch, her hands pressed to her face. "He's right, you know," he said quietly, adjusting his belt. "Assumptions have consequences." He didn't wait for her response, just turned and headed back to the patrol car to wait for the forensic team, leaving her alone with the wreckage of her choices. Darius didn't look back as he crossed the street, the familiar outline of his home coming into view. The oak tree rustled in the breeze, its leaves whispering secrets the night couldn't hold. He stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him, and for a moment he just stood there, letting the silence settle. The laptop still glowed on the dining table, the router app open like a wound he hadn't closed. He walked over, shut it down, and sank into the sofa, his head tipping back against the leather. His chest rose and fell, slow and deliberate, as the adrenaline drained away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. Outside, the forensic team arrived, their van rumbling into the street as flashlights bobbed across Melanie's yard. Voices overlapped, Navarro barking orders, techs unloading gear. But inside Darius's walls, it was just him and the truth. Brandon was gone, headed for a cell, his dark web handlers now a target for a cybercrime unit that wouldn't rest until Spectre was uprooted. The cameras were off, the feed severed. But the violation lingered, a ghost in the corners of his home. He'd been watched, his neighbors had been watched, by a kid desperate enough to sell their privacy for a lifeline, and by a faceless group who'd turned that desperation into a weapon. But it wasn't just Brandon's betrayal that gnawed at him. It was Melanie's call, the sirens, the moment he'd stood in his yard with two cops sizing him up, all because he dared to exist in a space she couldn't control. He'd uncovered the threat, turned the tables, but the sting of that first accusation wouldn't fade. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, its rhythm steady against the chaos of the hours before. Darius closed his eyes, letting the darkness wash over him, and made a quiet promise to himself. He'd keep his guard up, not just against hackers or shadows, but against the kind of blindness that had started this mess. Because if there was one thing he learned, it was this. Sometimes the real danger wasn't the one watching from afar. It was the one standing right beside you, too afraid to see the truth. Crestwood Lane will never be the same. A single phone call, born from fear, fueled by assumption, nearly destroyed an innocent man, while the real threat hid in plain sight. Melanie thought she was the hero, protecting her world from a shadow that didn't exist. Instead, she handed Darius a fight he didn't ask for and uncovered a betrayal she'll carry forever. Brandon sold his soul for a way out, but the cost was higher than he'll ever pay back. Inspector, they're still out there, lurking in the dark corners of the web, waiting for the next weak link. But here's the truth we can't ignore. We're all one snap judgment away from ruining someone or missing the danger that's staring us in the face. Melanie didn't see Darius. She saw a stranger she didn't trust. She didn't see Brandon. She saw a kid she wanted to save. And in that blindness, she lost more than she'll ever know. So take a step back, look harder, ask questions before you point fingers, because the next time you assume you know the story, you might be the one calling the wrong number, and the price could be everything. If this hit you, share it. You never know who needs to hear this lesson before it's too late.